Today, the death of the theater is predicted on almost a daily basis. And to paraphrase Mark Twain, the reports are always greatly exaggerated. We've also all heard somebody say that come the end of the world, the only survivors will be the cockroaches. Cockroaches have been around for 300 million years. They've outlasted the dinosaurs by 150 million years. And they are tough little creatures. They can survive on cellulose and in a pinch each other, and they can even soldier on without a head for a week or two. Yeah. And they're fiendishly fast, as many of us know when we opened an apartment door, turned on the lights, and watched them scatter. Okay? Cockroaches have the reputation for being survivors. They can live through anything from steaming hot water to a nuclear holocaust. And if and when they do survive Armageddon, they will probably be performing theater. There is something of the scrappy cockroach in every actor that hammers out a living. And theater has survived a variety of end-of-the-word scenarios since its earliest beginnings. Now, in the Stone Ages, men and women were telling stories by enacting them even when no language existed. Ancient Greek theater still inspires us and continues to be staged in every language in the world. In ancient Greece, attending theater was a cultural necessity. It was one's duty. It was a citizen's responsibility to attend the great annual week-long festivals of tragedies and comedies in Athens to honor Dionysus, the Greek god of fertility, of wine, agriculture, and sexuality. For 100 years, the festival of Dionysus was the benchmark of Western civilization. But it didn't start that way. The illuminating tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides all emerged from a pagan ritual known as the choric dithyramb. 50 wine-drunken priests, clad in goatskin, would dance around a 10-foot phallus in front of an audience, chanting odes to Dionysus on a cleared piece of flat circular land, the threshing circles that were used for harvesting grain. The threshing circle eventually was called the orchestra and became the basis for the stage for the massive Greek amphitheaters. Most of these priests were also high on hallucinatory mushrooms. The dithyrambs were coarse, vulgar, and orgiastic. Perhaps theater's bad rap starts here. For the choric dithyramb was indeed the Woodstock of its day. The Greek word for actor was Hippocrates, hypocrite. To this very day, actors are often thought of as liars and dissemblers. Now, these dithyrambs evolved and became part of the great festivals. They were called satyr plays, referring to the goatskins worn by the priests, the origin of our word satire today. 3 tragedies would be presented at these festivals, and each playwright would then write a satyr play in which they would make fun of the previous 3 works. Think of Mel Brooks' Spaceballs lampooning the original Star Wars trilogy. In ancient Greece, we had an empire ensconced in domestic barbarism and military adventurism, yet it was the theater that reformulated the debates of that era with humility, humanity, and intelligence, and put those qualities back in the air that we still breathe 2,000 years later. When the Romans conquered the Greeks, they spent most of their time wishing they were Greeks. The Romans simply changed the names of the Greek gods to Roman ones. Same god, different name. Zeus becomes Jupiter, Dionysus becomes Bacchus. And so it was with their theater, too. It was like taking a successful foreign film and making an Americanized Hollywood version. The Romans were the original channel surfers. Theater had to compete with gladiatorial contests, giant sea battles staged in amphitheaters, wild animals fighting humans, and of course the ever-popular lions eating Christians attraction. It was the mime troops that kept on going despite the popular taste for blood. If it bleeds, it leads, applied to the fickle Roman audience's insatiable appetite for greater violence and spectacle. Now, the mime companies, these are not the silent mimes we think of today, but were more like an ancient Second City troupe, or this Greek hour has 22 minutes, making fun of the events of the day. The Roman theater reached its height during the 4th century AD, and it would survive for another 200 years, but had already encountered difficulties that would eventually nearly destroy it. The key opposition was the rising of the Christian church. At first, this new sect was very weak. Now, the Romans, they were willing to accept this new Hebrew god as another deity, but were unwilling to abandon the other gods out of a desire to offend no one. The Christians insisted that all the other gods were false. And it was that intractability that resulted in the decision of Rome to stamp out this new religion as a subversive element in the state. But in spite of persecution, as we all know, the power of Christianity gradually increased until the profession of any other religion but Christianity was unlawful. And the theater was the favorite target of the Christians. The licentiousness of the mimes offended the moral sense of the church leaders, because the mimes had ridiculed Christian practices like baptism and the sacrament of bread and wine. Think Monty Python and their 1979 comedy film, The Life of Brian, that tells the story of Brian Cohen, a young Jewish man who was born on the same day as and next door to Jesus Christ and is subsequently mistaken for the Messiah. Right? Well, that film drew accusations of blasphemy and protests from religious groups. I remember as a young teenager going to see it at my local movie theater in Brockville and getting there, and surrounding the theater were all the different church groups with placards trying to stop us from getting in. And I think the thing that bothered the most was the final scene in this movie where Brian is hanging from the cross in the hot sun. He finds his spirits lifted by his fellow sufferers who break into song with, "Always look on the bright side of life." The Python trope used the church's protests to benefit their marketing campaign, with ads stating, "So funny it was banned in Norway." The break between church and theater was inevitable, and soon it was excommunication for anyone who went to the theater rather than the church on holy days. Actors were forbidden the sacraments of the church unless they forswore their profession, a decree not rescinded in many places until the 18th century. Actors were treated as heretics for nearly 1,300 years. For example, can you imagine the great French playwright Molière collapsing on stage to his death and being denied the last rites? King Louis XIV had to intervene to grant Molière a Christian burial. The little church around the corner in New York City was for quite a while the only church in New York that performers were accepted at. Is it little wonder that theater is often said to be the world's second oldest profession and has been damned in praise since that first choric dithyramb? Following the disintegration of the Roman Empire, Western Europe entered the Dark Ages, and theater virtually disappeared, with the exception of the tattered remnants of the Roman mimes. Still today, you can't keep a good mime down, even with the medieval Pope's death squads. And we had minstrels. Alan O'Dale of Robin Hood's legendary Merry Men is a descendant of that minstrel. Pagan festivals and the new Christian ceremonies. Now, the Catholic Church, in seeking to convert Western Europe to Christianity, usurped the pagan festivals. Many pagan rites were related to the midwinter solstice and sought to revive the waning sun by bringing evergreen trees indoors and lighting candles on the branches, our modern-day Christ Mass trees, or by lighting bonfires or torches, or by wild ecstatic dancing, often involving costumed demon figures being routed out. The date of Christ's birth was not fixed until December 25th, until the 4th century. This date was chosen to displace the winter solstice festival. Easter was located to replace the spring fertility festivals, which is why we now have an Easter Sunday with Jesus ascending into heaven while a fertile pagan rabbit bears sweet candy temptations. The Roman Catholic Church absorbed much of pagan religion, and many pagan gods and goddesses became Roman Catholic saints. Bacchus became Saint Bacchus. Dionysius became St. Denis or Denis. The church had even renamed both the Greek and Roman versions. As time went by, the rites of the Catholic Church became more elaborate, and theater ultimately emerged again out of these elaborations during the Middle Ages, 600 years later. As long as theater was sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church and served the Christian faith, theater was in the good books again, or the good book, to be more specific. For the next 600 years, the medieval drama flowered into the great biblical play cycles, complete with touring pageant wagons and stories from Genesis to the Apocalypse. Townspeople would gather in the market squares. Old hay wagons were parked side by side. Each wagon was a stage for a different Bible story. And it didn't matter what order they were told in, because God sanctioned them all. So you could have the Last Supper, followed by Noah's Ark, followed by Jonah and the whale, followed by the Nativity, and so on and so on. It was a community event in the truest sense of the word, bringing God's word to the common folk. Today's Christian Sunday school pageants had their origins in these amateur theatrics. But suddenly, church drama almost completely disappeared. Why? Politics. The Roman Catholic Church became weakened by internal conflicts. It soon became evident that the most effective means of control lay in the election of the Pope. So rulers began competing to influence the choice, and naturally, corruption followed. Many of the church's practices, most notoriously the selling of indulgences, spiritual pardons, had led for demands for reform. No one could buy their way into heaven. The Reformation followed as dissident groups set out to reform Christianity. Now, the theater could not remain aloof from these events. In England, Henry VIII's disgruntled marriage bed and his subsequent tabloid headline divorce saw him breaking with the Catholic Church and creating the Protestant Church. Of course, this led to bitter controversies in which theater was used as a weapon to attack or defend either Protestant or Catholic dogmas. The Catholics were persecuted and burned at the stake by the Protestants under Henry's reign. Then the Protestants were persecuted and burned at the stake under the Catholic rule of Henry's daughter, Mary I, the notorious Bloody Mary. She'd probably be a WWF wrestler today. It was one bad moon rising after another. In an attempt to still the conflict, Elizabeth I, Henry's unwanted Protestant daughter, upon coming to the throne, forbade all religious plays. Now, this prohibition of religious subject matter led to other changes. First, the playwrights had to return to non-religious subjects. And doing so, they took advantage of this new revived interest in Greek and Roman works. And this resulting blend of classical and medieval heritages did much to create the great drama of the Renaissance. Secondly, the abandonment of religious subject matter destroyed the last remaining basis for an international drama. No more Latin, the former universal language of the Catholic Church across Europe. Countries now develop their own national interests and characteristic style. Third, when the Bible cycles were forbidden, the active support of the clergy and town councils, who would previously sanction and finance them, was withdrawn. These groups would not support the work of the professional actor seeking to entertain for pay. The church had never rescinded the condemnation of professional actors pronounced in Roman times, and now the censure was reiterated. Once again, religion had become the enemy of theater. As a result, the relationship of theater to society underwent a drastic change. Now theater had to wage for recognition on purely commercial and artistic grounds, and survive it did. The Renaissance brought us the great English playwrights of Shakespeare, himself a closet Catholic, Marlowe, rumored to be a religious spy, and others. The theater flourished into the mid-17th century, but that old end-of-the-world scenario was just around the Puritan corner. Oliver Cromwell, probably the most hated man in Irish history. He killed an estimated 500,000 Irish Catholics on his quest to wipe out Catholicism, not to mention the beheading of Charles I. Unlike the cockroach, Charles couldn't survive without his head. Cromwell overthrew the monarchy and made himself Lord Protector. He had more power than anyone else in Britain. The theaters were closed, torn down, because the Puritans said the devil used them. All actors were seized and whipped, and anyone caught attending a play was fined. Finally, in 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne. The power of the Puritans was done with, and the theaters rebuilt and opened again using tennis courts. That's right. The new theaters were built using tennis courts. You had the net, audience one side, actors on the other. Okay. The reopening of the theaters signaled a renaissance of English drama, Restoration comedy. The Restoration comedy is notorious for its sexual explicitness, a quality encouraged by Charles II and his rakish aristocratic court. Playgoers were attracted to the comedies by their up-to-the-minute topical writing, by crowded and bustling plots, by the rise of the first celebrity actors, but more so by the introduction of the first professional actresses to the stage and the scandalous breeches part. That refers to roles that required women to dress in men's attire, specifically breeches and tights, their stockings, so their calves were on display. Today, billboards and magazine ads advertising jeans focus on the butt as the symbol of sexuality. But during the Restoration, it was the sexy calf. When Larry Gelbart created the TV series MASH in the 1970s, all the characters were based on Restoration comedy stock types. Hawkeye and Trapper John, the witty rakes. Frank Burns, the fop. Radar and Klinger, our wily servants. Colonel Blake, the incompetent old man figure. Winchester, the arrogant braggart. And Hot Lips Houlihan, the heroine and seductress. But the tolerance for Restoration comedy quickly ran out by the end of the 17th century. Public opinion turned to respectability and seriousness even faster than the playwrights did. Now, causes for this shift in taste were the new monarchs, William and Mary's dislike of theater. We had the rise of a hard-working mercantile middle class who did not like to see themselves ridiculed on stage and who worked hard to put bread on the table, unlike the idle rich aristocracy, plus newspaper articles attacking the immorality of the stage. The comedy of sex and wit was replaced by the drama of obvious sentiment and exemplary morality. And so it was to be for another 100 years. Theater remained beige, static, and stagnant. But by the early 19th century, a new movement called Romanticism had emerged as man sought to get back to the essence of nature, for the source of his divine, spiritual truth. Idealism pays off. The works of Jane Austen, for example. Now, don't confuse this with Pride and Prejudice with zombies. Okay? The 2009 parody novel by Seth Graham Smith. Did you know that as of April 9th, 2009, Pride and Prejudice with zombies was number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list? That kind of says it all. But at least the zombies have regenerated a new interest in the original novel. Slaying zombies is one thing, but slaying theater is another thing altogether. All began to change by the mid-19th century. It was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and people were swarming into cities from the country in search of work in the new factories. It was a heyday of nationalism and imperialism. Nations expanded overseas, motivated by the need of raw materials and markets to support the rapid industrialization. Britain acquired the largest empire, followed by Germany. "The sun never sets on the British Empire," was the slogan of the day. Industry and trade encouraged the advance of technology, and each new invention increased the people's faith in science and engineering to solve our human problems. Nevertheless, benefits were not evenly distributed, and the working classes had to fight for every increase in their rights. Unions were now formed, and strikes became their principal weapons. It was a time when the common man began to assert himself through programs of action other than revolution, and to demand his worth and dignity be recognized and respected. Charles Dickens took up the fight and wrote novels attacking the plight of the homeless, the downtrodden, slums, and appalling work conditions. Reformers now no longer expected to achieve changes overnight. In search of pragmatic solutions, they rejected the idealistic visions of the Romantics, and it was out of this pragmatism that a new theater movement, realism, emerged and initiated the modern theater. an era still underway. Theater now had to depict truthfully the real physical world. Henrik Ibsen, often referred to as the founder of modern drama, was the first playwright to achieve fully the goals that had been set out by the realists. Above all, it was his plays A Doll's House and Ghosts that shocked conservative audiences and served as a rallying cry for the new supporter of the theater of ideas. In his play A Doll's House, Nora, upon realizing that she has always been treated as a doll in her marriage, chooses to leave her husband and children in order to become a person in her own right. At that time, people didn't do such things. Women didn't do such things. In Ghosts, Mrs. Alving, conforming to traditional morality, has remained with a cheating husband, only to have her son go mad, presumably from inherited syphilis. Both plays question the institution of marriage when questions were not being asked, and the allusion to venereal disease in Ghosts made it such a storm center at that time throughout the world that it was forbidden production in most countries. Realism has remained today the dominant mode of playwrights and filmmakers. Now, the start of the 20th century was considered a time of promise, of potential to be realized. The future was eagerly awaited. Technology was considered by many as the solution to mankind's problems. Science and the rational were supreme. And then the Titanic sunk. But the real beginning of the 20th century, however, theatrically and in many other cases, came with World War I, one of the most insane wars in the history of the world. The war that could not be called off because that would have interfered with the German High Command's train schedules. Technology produced new and terrifying and effective ways to destroy people, poison gas. The future had turned into a nightmare. Reason had produced chaos. Artists were particularly appalled and turned to the movements of Dada and Expressionism to express their feelings of nihilism. The Dadaists deliberately did theater that did not make sense. It's like the old Dada joke. A walrus and a rabbit are sharing a bath. And the walrus says to the rabbit to hand him the soap. The rabbit replies, "What do you think I am, a typewriter?" A typewriter? That's right. Is this thing on? Okay. Theater was there on the front lines, in the trenches, screaming at the insanity of it all, but to little avail, for soon war repeated itself. World War II was the most expensive war fought in terms of people killed, property destroyed, and the number of countries involved. It made use of the most deadly weapons yet devised, including bombers, ballistic missiles, and the atomic bomb. The German extermination camps are one of the great blots on our human history. In the middle of the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was asked by fellow politicians to shut down the theaters in order to save money for the war effort. He replied, "What are we fighting for then?" We need a Winston Churchill now. At the end of the war, Europe was divided into sectors. East dominated by Russia, the West dominated by the USA. And this led to the Cold War between these two nations. As a result, during the 1950s, the world lived under the threat of an atomic war capable of ending life on Earth. It was an age of anxiety and stress. The theater was heavily influenced by the horrors of war and the threats of impending disaster. Serious questions were being raised about man's capacity to act responsibly or even survive. Anxiety and guilt became the major themes. Samuel Beckett became the characteristic dramatist of the 1950s. Probably more than any other writer, Beckett expressed the post-war doubts about man's capacity to understand and control his world. Now, the end of the world really was around the corner, but it hadn't stopped theater. The cockroach artist kept holding that cracked and broken mirror up to man's doubtful nature. But in the late 1950s, an even greater threat emerged to theater's very existence: the advent of television and society's move to the suburbs. In 1948, there were 48 TV stations in North America, but by 1958, 10 years later, there were 512 and over 50 million television sets. And It was free. As a result, the price of theater tickets doubled, and the cost of mounting a show increased at a still faster rate. Under these circumstances, producers now chose shows with broad appeal. American theater was reduced to a few small Broadway productions. So this served to motivate the creation of the off-Broadway movement. By playing in out-of-the-way theaters or improvised auditoriums, production costs were cut down, and works which would not appeal to a mass audience could be played for more restricted groups. And soon, off-Broadway became the workable alternative to Broadway's commercialism. The civil unrest of the 1960s and the resultant triptych of American assassinations greatly affected the art of theater. Peaceful protests and passive resistance gave way to more violent means seeking violent ends. We now saw an off-Broadway explosion as new provocative playwrights ignited a new American theater, including the psychological theatricality and scathing dialogue of Edward Albee, the volatile language plays of Sam Shepard, and the strangely lyrical choral dramas of Lanford Wilson. Albee's controversial play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, was selected for the 1963 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. However, the awards advisory board objected to the play's then controversial use of profanity and sexual themes, and they overruled the awards advisory committee, awarding no Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1963. In the eyes of mainstream 1960s North Americans, these lean, mean, and shocking playwrights couldn't be the future of theater. These artists were the Generation X of their time. Timothy Leary's slackers, the youth who tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. Their plays were produced in cafes, basements, lofts, and churches, and they despised everything commercial theater represented. And they did indeed become the future of professional playwriting. Canada is a young country in terms of our theater, in particular playwriting. Our own original voices really began to emerge in the late 60s and early 70s with the alternative theater movement. Writers like Michel Tremblay and David French, David Fenario, James Reaney, George F. Walker, and the collective creations of Paul Thompson and Theatre Passe Muraille. The 1970s engendered another new wave of playwrights, but despite their individual brilliance, none of them has emerged as the single master playwright in the sense of Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller or Shakespeare. Nor is it likely there will be a single powerful voice that will dominate again. Television changed that. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan's Republican policies chilled many creative impulses by producing an atmosphere that de-emphasized the arts at the same time as it promoted materialism in its most virulent form. In Canada, we saw it under Brian Mulroney. England had Margaret Thatcher, and the Oliver Stone film Wall Street's mantra, "Greed is good," epitomized the decade. But probably the most significant development in the 1980s was the emergence of the mega musical. From Cats in 1982 that started it all, to the Phantom of the Opera, to Disney's Beauty and the Beast and the Lion King, to the injury-plagued, opening-delayed Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. All of these musicals rely heavily on special and highly mechanical scenic effects. The mega musicals have become event theater and have made it that much more difficult for smaller shows to survive or even get a chance to find an audience. It's much like the 3D movement in movies today. We are being assaulted by special effects, but bigger is not better. It gives one hope to see that The King's Speech won this year's Best Picture Oscar, an intelligent, actor-driven literary work that almost feels like theater. In the more temperate climate of the 1990s, playwrights chose to raise the flag of artistic multiculturalism, dumping out the melting pot and demystifying it. For example, Tony Kushner's Pulitzer Prize-winning Angels in America, a political epic dealing with the AIDS crisis in the 80s. A revival is currently now running on off-Broadway. Today, many playwrights use explosive theatrics to strike out against a society torn by brutality and violence, a culture gone awry, particularly since 9/11. British playwright Robert Soane's powerful 2005 work, Talking to Terrorists, is entirely composed of interviews with people who have been involved in terrorist movements and people affected in some way by terrorism. is one of the most intelligent and artful examinations of world affairs in the past decade. 50 years ago, Joseph Papp, the founder of the Public Theatre and Free Shakespeare in Central Park, proclaimed that people could not do without the theatre. But can we? Movies and television are far more consumable than the theatre. They cost less, and we all have easier access to them. And now Netflix is replacing DVDs, so you don't even have to leave the comfort of your couch and laptop. Theatre has survived religious persecution, war, the rise of television, AIDS, funding cuts. But beginning in the late 20th century, new technologies have facilitated a rapid-fire information flow that continues to become faster with each passing day. Can theatre survive this future? A home theatre system is a travesty to the art of theatre. Is evolution caused largely by capitalism slowly causing the word theatre to be drained of all its meaning? And how do we engage the new millennials? You are theatre's future audience and guardian of its survival. Sociologists created the term millennials to designate you young people born since 1980 and raised in the sensory-inundated environment of digital technology and mass media at the millennium. A Nelson report was released 2 years ago, focusing on 8,000 college students. The research translates as follows. 97% of you own a computer. 94% own a cell phone. 56% of you have an MP3 player. 76% of you use instant messaging, mostly in my classroom. Kidding. 90% of you report multitasking while instant messaging. You spend at least 3.5 hours a day online. 69% of you have a Facebook account that you log into 3 times a day, at least. Now you add in YouTube and Twittering and video games, and we appear to be web surfing on a fast-moving wave toward a kind of globally engineered wipeout. With this wipeout, the sort of independence of thought and language that gets expressed through the arts in general, and in great theater in particular, gets dashed on the rocks. With this wipeout, history is either forgotten or rewritten or reduced to a few slogans. Here, the kinds of belligerence and barbarism that have always been part of the contemporary fabric of life are given freer and freer rein, while the qualities of compassion and critical thought, which have also been the fabric of contemporary life, slowly wash out to sea. People now can break up with a text message. Zero accountability. And if I found it on the internet, it must be true. What happens to critical debate? And do the people who belittle theater do so out of fear? Because theater has the capacity to say unpredictable and unpleasant things. The truth. The former Soviet Union simply took artists it didn't like and either shot them or exiled them to Siberia, not to mention China. Fortunately, we are not killing or dumping theater in the West. But are we trying to dump theater in general? We live in a dangerous era now where the arts are being seriously questioned. In an uncertain economy, art is often among the first things to be eliminated from discretionary spending. But might there be a backlash? Is a technological meltdown coming? Is the human soul screaming for meaning? How much spiritual hunger and alienation can we truly bear? Despite the sheer volume of information and stories that we receive on a daily basis, we have lost the scale of Sophocles, Shakespeare, and Marlowe. Many of these classic plays, left uncut, run for several hours and contain every possible human emotion and activity: love, lust, hatred, fidelity, hope, despair, bravery, fear, friendship, honor, greed, jealousy, revenge, ambition, pride, compassion, grace, humility, and redemption. The theater has always been, at least for me, about rekindling the soul and discovering what makes each of us human. It is the touchstone to our humanity. It is the most immediate way in which a human being can share with another the sense of what it is to be a human being. It speaks to something within each of us that is fleeting and intangible, and we feel less alone. Harold Bloom has argued that Shakespeare invented the human. His point was well taken. Shakespeare and the many writers that preceded him effectively passed on a theatrical model that interrogates, restores, and rekindles the human soul. If you 20-somethings open yourselves up to the experience of live theater, you will be rewarded with the gift that accompanies all great drama, the capacity to live on a level that non-theater goers will never experience, and an opportunity to profit from thousands of years of wisdom. In Shakespeare's day, great plays were thought of as mirrors. When you see a play, you are looking into a mirror, a pretty special mirror, one that reflects the world in a way that allows us to see its true nature. We also see that it not only reflects the world around us, but also ourselves. This two-way mirroring means that learning about great theater and learning about life go hand in hand. And it means that finding beauty and meaning in great theater is sort of a proving ground for finding beauty and meaning in life. The classics are packed with so much information and so many lessons that as we get older and our life experiences become more varied, the pathos of a particular moment that might never meant too much to us in our youth tends to suddenly take on a much deeper meaning. Theater is genuine communication, not short-form Twitters and tweets. An audience is alive in the same space where the actors testify the truth of their characters. Any place where you are in that kind of public forum, breathing the same air, like right here and now, us together, the truth will come out. There is a sanctity as to what we do as theater artists. People gather together to experience things that can't otherwise be experienced. Not unlike what happens in a church or a synagogue. There's an elevation, a nobility, and a feeling of sanctuary. Arthur Miller said, "My feeling is that people in group, in mass, watching something, react differently and perhaps more profoundly than they do in their living rooms." Theater is incomplete without an audience. It is that special communion between actor and audience that is so unique. The power of the stage is enormous because it is real. We all live in what is, but we find 1,000 ways not to face it. Great theater strengthens our faculty to face it. Theater provides for the psychic well-being and sanity of a society. When you look at the growth in the economy, it is evident there is need for idea generators. Countries are not necessarily the producers of goods anymore. Economies now thrive based on the production of ideas. Facts are just facts. And as a society, with a touch of the calculator or a hit of Google, young people, you can find a factual answer. But that can't teach a mind to be subtle and flexible. Theater makes us smarter, braver human beings. Theater helps connect the head to the heart. Theater contains the importance of reading. A play has the ability to jump the story off the page and bring it to life. This can be a revelation to the regular bookworm, but it's a real boon to reluctant readers. While plays work to jumpstart the imagination, they also lengthen the attention span. By sitting through a play, a young theater goer develops the ability to focus and absorb new information for 2 hours or so. And throughout history, theater has been a primary means of teaching. Medieval theater taught about the Bible and Christianity. Shakespeare's histories can be seen as defending Elizabeth's monarchy. Is there a reason to study the dead past in something like theater? The usual reason to study theater is the old cliche that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. Well, would that were so. Would that we could repeat Sophocles, Euripides, Marlowe, and Shakespeare simply by ignoring them. There will always be something magic about the lifting of a curtain or the opening blackout in a theater, about sharing a special place with strangers who become partners in this unfolding experience, about the moment when three-dimensional actors begin to speak their lines, and bits of acting or snippets of dialogue that take your breath away. There's always that expectation and that hope that we will see our collective selves truthfully for the first time. How many or few of us get this feeling from the plethora of electronic entertainment products? Although America elected a movie star as their president in the 1980s, it may never convey that honor on one of its playwrights, as the Czech Republic did when its citizens selected Václav Havel, a world-renowned playwright, as its first president some years ago. In his address on World Theater Day in March 1974, he told the world that he did not believe that theater was dwindling in importance. Rather, he thought that it was better suited than any of the electronic entertainment media to reveal the light and dark forces of present-day existence. He went on to say, "Yes, theater is not just another genre, one among many. It is the only genre in which today and every day, now and always, living human beings address and speak to other human beings. Because of that, theater is more than just the performance of stories and tales. It is a place for human encounter, a space for authentic human existence. Above all, the kind of existence that transcends itself in order to give an account of the world and itself. It is a place of living, specific, inimitable conversation about society and its tragedies, about man, his love, his anger and hatred. Theater is a point at which the intellectual and spiritual life of the human community crystallizes. It is a space in which it can exercise its freedom and come to understanding." March 27th is World Theater Day. World Theater Day isn't about creating a global theater experience. It's about celebrating the local theater experience globally. World Theater Day is an acknowledgement that we are all doing this thing that we love. And where the new technology does serve theater is that the internet allows us to share those local celebrations and revel in the fact that we are not alone in our pursuit, and that no matter how many times they may try to prove it mathematically, theater is not dead. The cockroaches are on the move. Thank you.
I'm just curious, what got you into theater?
Well, I grew up in Brockville, Ontario, and as a kid in the late 60s, you didn't have a lot to do. You had a choice of hockey or, right? So I was lucky, and I grew up also when there were still large suburban neighborhoods just being started. So we were like 50 kids in my neighborhood with a lot of time on our hands. So, a lot of it, as kids, we began, creating radio plays when we were grade 7, and then shooting our own little movies in grade 8 and doing movies in high school. And I got involved in Sears Drama Festivals and doing school plays. And I was a very shy kid, and it was an English teacher when I was in grade 9. They were doing the school musical No No Net that year, right? And they were short boys for chorus. Big surprise, not enough guys for chorus. That never happens, right? So he came to me and said, "Would you be interested in being in the chorus of No No Net?" And I said, okay, and it was, like I said, I was 14, and it transformed me because, wow, suddenly you had every grade there working together collectively, and it didn't matter that I was in grade 9 and I was working with grade 13s. We all became a community, and I suddenly found this whole new place that I figured, this is my fit, right? Because this is the place where misfits fit, right? That's the paradox of it all, too. And that was a big starter for me, Catherine, was those experiences, then doing it in high school, and realizing that it was in my DNA. So, and I'd found my home.
This may be a generalized statement, but just from my exposure to what's available to us, it's become more and more obvious that there's been somewhat of a decline with the technical aspects of theater creation and putting together crews and people who are well versed. Thankful to Rep 21, there's exposure to so many students to these aspects of theater, which are so important. But in terms of education in the whole picture, and for instance, secondary education, I did not see very much exposure to any of the technical aspects of creating theater.
I think, and that's a challenge too. I mean, I think part of it, in our case, Jeremy, is we live in a smaller community, and some of the resources are limited. And some of the resources are limited in terms of the amount of people we have that are professional technical theater experts, right? And fortunately, we do have a number in this community that lend their expertise and do help out. But we need more of it, right? And I would agree with you in terms of this community, what it does face is the lack of experienced technical theater people, right? And that, whether it's through training, it's difficult. There used to be, Theatre Ontario used to offer workshops, right, that they paid for. The government paid for these back in the day when they were funded, so that lighting design would come into a community for like a weekend and really do intense training projects, right? And that funding no longer exists. So it's one of the great challenges that we do face, I think, is how do we train new people in those areas when there isn't the funding to do so and there isn't the resources directly. So it's a challenge, Chair. I agree with you.
Having been through high school, I've found for myself, the Shakespeare and the classics that you mentioned in your lecture aren't taught a lot in most schools. If I wouldn't have been taught that in younger life, I would never have known. How do you feel on that?
Well, it's a tricky thing because there is this push to keep being relevant to your generation, which we have to be as educators. It's important, right? And I do believe that teaching, we're good coaches and we're mentors, and we got to come to you and find what makes you tick and share information that way. But there can be a danger in that by getting too much involved in meeting you guys at your levels of experiences and where you're at, that we forget about introducing those other aspects like Shakespeare, the Greeks, and the Romans in high school. And I think perhaps there's a fear around it because it's daunting work, it's difficult work. But I think we need to get back to those classics, the way in the Renaissance, right? When they forbade religious plays, all the artists went back to the classics and created all the great theater of the Renaissance. I think we're now due for a neo-classical revolution, but we got to get back to the Romans and the Greeks and the Renaissance to inform the work of today and get it back in the high schools and get teachers who feel confident teaching it and instill their love, right? Because love, passion breeds passion, right? Mentors create mentors. We pay it forward all the time in teaching and in the work that we do, and that's where the love comes too.
Rod, you said at the very end that theater is not dead. Is that the same thing as saying theater is alive and well?
Yes. In my opinion, it is. Theater is alive and well. And because, you know, we talk about boom and bust periods, right? I think for theater, it's always been a bust period. So that means that we've always been able to survive, right? And that we've always been up against obstacles. So theater is going to keep surviving, and it will be alive and well. And I do believe that cockroaches will be doing like dinner theater at the apocalypse.
You talk extensively about theater going through different eras as the world has changed and as the world has gone through wars and politics and struggles, so theater has evolved along with that. Do you think in this new age of technology that theater is on the cusp of another new era?
Well, theater, even more than Madonna, has had to reinvent itself all the time, right? So I think theater will continue, Ashley, to keep reinventing itself as it responds to what's going on in the world, and there'll be new theater artists that will respond. Like we're seeing it now with new theater artists that are going green, that they're really getting concerned about the environment, right? That's important. And I think theater, because theater is, that's what it does. It's a mirror to what's going on in the world. It's a mirror to what we're doing in the world. So of course that mirror is going to shift as society shifts, right? So that's why I think it will always be with us, because we need that vehicle to know we're human, to know we're not alone, to know what it's like to be human, to be connected, right? And if I can say to all of you guys that are the new theater visionaries of tomorrow, that are the leaders of theater tomorrow, always remember the play is the thing. It's always the play and about telling a good story and having a good play when you're writing it and telling it it's about the story. Good stories.
Just going back on the subject where you said theater is not dead, it's alive and well, I've had statements said along the lines of that classical theater is dead and no longer relatable, and what people should be doing is taking modern TV series and turning those into stage productions because they would be more relatable. I'm just wondering if you could state an opinion on how you feel about that.
Well, first, I do feel that it's a big enough gene pool that there's rooms for all different styles and approaches to theater. But certainly in my mind, the classics aren't dead at all. They're not dead. They're still being produced at the Stratford Festival. We still have major Shakespeare festivals in BC, in regional festivals in Ontario, in the East Coast, still going strong, right? There is that. And I do believe that it's just getting you young acting students and students to get turned on to Shakespeare and discover that it's something quite amazing and exciting, and it's not, and then that's where it sits. It's that saying the classics are dead, it's because it takes a bit of work, right? You have to make a deal when you read those that I'm going to invest myself into this, and it's not going to be a first read that I've got it, right? It's not a Big Mac consumption reading item, right? You've got to revisit it. And that may be too. And that may fall into what you just said is interesting, is about this kind of like global ADHD that we have, with shortened attention spans and multitasking that makes it more difficult for someone to sit down with that work, right? And read it. And I do believe theater is a tonic for that and does offer solutions in this world that way, as I said in my lecture, about improving attention spans and helping with reading and helping with literacy, which is a challenge at college levels and university levels, and there are surveys coming out about the drops in literacy and what we have to do. We're on the front lines, you know, and that's crucial. And I do think, again, classical theater does help.
You said that it's important for young people and young performers to get excited about Shakespeare and the classics. But I also know that a lot of young performers today are working under the impression that the only way to get work is to make work. And I personally have a lot of friends who are starting their own companies and just trying to get together groups of young artists to create theater. What is your opinion about these young companies in tackling the big plays like Shakespeare? I think
it's great. I think it's great that they're going out there and tackling it, right? We have one of my graduates, Anthony Leclerc, who's doing a Moliere, right? And that's terrific. And I think that's how the torch gets passed. That's the idea. And not being afraid to bite off those big projects, as long as, you got to approach them responsibly, and with an understanding, but it's a great testing ground, right? If you're coming at it. And I think that's great. And I do encourage young actors to create their own companies, create their own work, because that's the way to get work in other ways. And that's one of the things that Canada, in our program, we pride ourselves on, is trying to train entrepreneurial actors. Actors who create work for themselves, write work for themselves, so when they graduate from the college, they're not waiting for a telephone to ring. They're already making something happen, right? And then that leads to telephones ringing, right? And not your landlord, okay?
What you said before about original work, I'm just wondering how's that going to survive, because the musicals now are based on movies and TV shows like Spider-Man, Happy Days, Addams Family. I'm just wondering, is any original works going to survive?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it will, because they have for 2,000 years. I think they will, Catherine, because there are always going to be playwrights out there that have a great idea, right? And they find their way. And if you work, and you find your way, and you just stick to it, right? We see that with the new shows that get produced off-Broadway. Canadian theater is some of the finest theater in the world. In our country, I'm so proud to be a Canadian with the kind of theater we do, right? And we have wonderful writers in this country that are creating brilliant and interesting new work all the time. So yes, there always will be room for original voices in theater, because that's the nature of the artist, right? It's like a shark, you just can't stop moving, right? You can't stop and you die, right? Right? So, great, thank you.